Hey, good evening, everybody. How you doing? This is Mike McCormick with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills. I'm in my conference room this evening, just for a different background, which at this point I kind of don't like. So I'll try something else next time. But we're here tonight to discuss why, and this is the question, why the first 48 hours mattered in the Sean Souter murder. Quite naturally, we're all perplexed about, how this whole murder happened. But from an investigative standpoint, as I just explained and talked about in the last video, just how essential, how important is that first 48 hours? I think I alluded to the TV show that I like, of how the detectives in those particular stories go about meticulously doing an investigation when it comes to a homicide. And they realize how important it is to get as much information as you can from witnesses on the scene of an actual homicide. I can honestly tell you the times when I was working back in the day in the 80s in the high crime areas that I worked in. Quite often I was first respondent, if you will, on a crime scene. And there were several duties that are, you have to do, that are your duties as the primary officer on the scene, and as well as backup officers when they get there. So all police departments have policies and procedures in place and directives that guide an officer's behavior on investigations when it comes to crime scenes. Many departments now work off of what they call best practices. That's typically a formulation of the best methods, if you will, to go about handling anything that's police related when you're dealing with citizens, and operational methods of conducting police business as well. So the U.S. Department of Justice has kind of put out guidelines since 2013 that deal with the best practices in investigating homicides, and pretty much a lot of agencies around the country fall in line with those best practices. Now, I just want to deviate just for a second and we'll get back to the 48-hour situation. I'm a comment recently on a interview conducted by Commissioner Davis with the Baltimore City Police Department, where the reporters asked him just recently, is Detective Sean Souter's case considered a cold case? And he indicated it is not a cold case because it's an ongoing investigation. Essentially, that's what he said. Well, I will tell you what the Department of Justice says when it comes to defining what a cold case is. They say that the definition of a cold case varies from agency to agency. So although the commissioner has in place what he believes his agency considers to be a cold case, there are other agencies around the country that don't, go in line with his philosophy. And the National Institute of Justice has said that it's an individual thing, depending on the agency's viewpoint. Now, the National Institute of Justice also says that a cold case is any case whose probative investigative leads have been exhausted. Okay, so there's a couple things, a couple key words and a couple adjectives that's being used in this particular statement when they talk about probative and investigative leads. So if you just take out those two words, probative investigator, you would just have any case whose leads have been exhausted. Okay? And if that were the case, you would be investigating a case all the time and it would never come to an end because you're just investigating leads and not giving any weight to probative investigative leads. So let's go to Black's Law Dictionary and determine what probative means in the legal sense. And it means any data that tends to prove or disprove a fact. Okay, so it's any data that the police department, or any leads that the police department gets that tend to prove or disprove a fact. And so generally speaking, what happens is that the police department already has a pretty good idea of the case in and of itself, generalities, maybe not so much specifics, but a lot of generalities. They have the physical evidence. They went on a scene and did the crime lab forensics that needed to be done And so, they pretty much have that. They don't have the other pieces that they need to formulate a lead that pans out. And the commissioner made several statements that he, in fact, in the homicide division, had many, many leads come in, but once they investigated those leads panned out and turned out to be nothing at all, meaning that they didn't have any probative value or worth to move the case to the next stage of investigation. And so that's why I want to bring that up, because you have to, you're out there investigating cases. You need to get stuff that information that comes in, what it's going to be that's going to tend to prove or disprove a fact. Now, like I say, once you have your case and you start getting leads, you start talking to people on the phone, or people come down to the district to talk to the detectives. The detective's going to be listening to the witnesses, and what they're saying. Does it coincide with what we already know, what we already have? Is there information that, how could this particular person know this unless they were there? Because that's information that we haven't put out to the public yet. That's information that we've, kept close to the vest, so to speak. So, I just thought I'd bring that up when we talk about what a cold case is and how it's not, strictly one department sees it one way, another department sees it another way. So it's not blanket. And I think when the commissioner was talking, he was kind of putting a blanket definition on a cold case, and that's just not true. So we'll move on. I wanted to get back to what we talked about, why the first 48 hours mattered in the Sean Souter case, and the first 48 hours matters in anybody's homicide. And there are two things, major things in this particular case that from the onset was going to be a problem for the police department. Number one, the primary witness left the scene of the crime. So Detective Bamenka rendered aid, which he's supposed to do when he saw that Sean Souter was down. Whatever aid that was, maybe just calling for assistance from medical folks. So he did that. Okay, so we don't know what else he did, because there's really been no conversation. That information has not been put out there to the media as to what else he did or didn't do. The other thing was that Detective Souter's body was moved from the scene of the crime, which at this point now makes it a little difficult for crime lab folks, because you have a body that was originally there, an alive body that was originally there, and that body moved because of first aid being rendered. So that left the crime lab with a scene where kind of hard to make kind of some determinations as to what actually occurred at that location, at that, because the body's not there to kind of point to it in and of itself. So that made it difficult as well. And this is why it also made it difficult that's why they had to come back to the scene a couple days later, because they had to wait for an autopsy, and that autopsy would have revealed, once they examined the detective's brain, the direction of travel of that particular round as it penetrated and exited the detective's brain. Now we know that they did find a bullet, a partial bullet, if you will, and that particular projectile was found in what they call another location, meaning that if you remember the interviews, they said they wanted to go back to expand the crime scene. So the crime scene, if you watch advanced criminology videos, if you go back to the video where we drew up the respective areas of the homicide area scene, where you had area B and area A, well, the original shooting took place in area A, in between two vacant buildings. The direction of travel of the round would have traveled eastbound from west to east in the ground in area B. So if you go back and you look at some of the videos that some of the local news media outlets put out there, you will see the crime lab now looking in another area. They're no longer looking in area A for evidence, they're looking in area B, okay, because that was the direction that was determined, having looked at the trajectory of the round from the officer's brain in that east side direction into the ground. Okay, so it certainly tells me that the perpetrator was taller than the officer. That's one. It tells me that he was taller than the officer. That's one, or that he had gained control of the officer where the officer was not in front of him, and the officer was behind him. In other words, the suspect was now behind the officer, and the officer's back was turned towards the suspect. And at some point, he had enough control over the officer that they were in a clinch mode, and that particular round was fired from being in a crouch position, in a wrestling position, if you will. It's kind of complicated the way I'm explaining it, but to find a round in the ground some 30 feet away tells me that that direction of travel was lower. It didn't hit anything. It impacted the ground itself. So that's just, kind of where I'm seeing this thing. So I just wanted to explain those couple things to you, right? That this particular case, you had a primary witness that left the scene, and you had the body that was removed. So all in all, those things make it tough for an investigator, right then and there. So let's get into responsibility of the initial officer on the scene. And unfortunately, Detective Bomeka is considered really the first officer on the scene. Despite him having to call back for backup, which he did, he's actually the first responder there. And as such, under policy number 1008, which talks about investigative operations, it says that as first responders, police officers assigned to the patrol division are responsible for conducting the preliminary investigation. Okay, so the preliminary investigation typically begins when the first officer gets on the scene. In this case here, he was the first officer that was there on the scene. Now, remember I talked about best practices? Okay, well, in this investigative operation policy, it states, it is the policy of the Baltimore Police Department to thoroughly investigate all crimes. Sworn and civilian members of the BPD will utilize recognized law enforcement best practices in the performance of their duties to bring what? A swift closure to crimes and to ensure the successful prosecution of criminal offenders. A preliminary investigation begins when an incident or crime is initially brought to the attention of a police officer. In this case, it would have been detective, either through direct contact with the citizen or call for service. Well, they never got a call for service. This was on view. Okay, so it was by direct contact with the perpetrator that these officers, or Detective Souter, acted the way he did, and as a result of his actions, Detective Bomeka responded to those actions. So when the loud burst of fire went off, shooting went off, rounds fired, excuse me, he reacted. Now, the commissioner has promised us, at least in Baltimore, I don't know if you guys have heard it around the country, but he's promised news media outlets for 3 weeks now that we would get to see the home video surveillance that was taken the day of the murder, which depicts and shows, according to the police commissioner, Detective Bomeka hearing the sounds of the rounds being fired and immediately running across the street from his initial location and taking cover. This is what the police commissioner says. Now, mind you, this is 3 weeks ago. So here it is now, 3 weeks. Now, I would have to say that if you recovered surveillance video from a private owner, that this surveillance video picked up a lot more than just the detective running across the street, because most homeowners leave their video surveillance stuff on 24/7. They don't turn it off. So, we don't know how the video will be edited in terms of what probative value, if you will, can be gleaned from that particular video. Certainly, we want to see what's in the background that's going on. We want to see the number of cars that are in the area, because that's important. We always talk about the direction of how suspects flee areas. Sure, they use vehicles and on foot. And again, and this is still yet to be determined, because Detective Bomeka never gave us a direction of travel from a suspect. And it's always been my contention, you can't do one without the other. You cannot see a suspect wearing something and then don't see the direction that he walks away or runs away in. The two just don't go hand in hand. It just doesn't work that way. I have never, ever in my life, in all the years when I was on the department, when I got into a foot chase or whatever the case may have been, I always knew the direction of travel the suspect was running in because I was given the coordinates over the radio to the surrounding areas who were on the perimeters who could easily, identify the suspect. And so I just, again, from a practitioner standpoint, I just find I'm at odds with that information, and I will always be at odds with that. Even if you don't even believe me, you ask other officers, just walk up to an officer one day that you don't even know and ask him, excuse me, officer, if you were in a foot chase with somebody, could you kind of tell me some of the things that you would put over the air about this individual? And the officer's going to tell you, he's going to put the description over, and he's also going to put the direction of travel. It's just that simple, okay? So I just thought I'd, kind of put it in perspective how important it is for that first responder, and particularly if he's on location when the incident happens. It's even a greater responsibility at that point because it's you're there. You have to get this information out, okay? And so when we talk about the first 48 hours, I'm going to narrow it down now to the first hour. The first hour of this particular case, in my estimation, went south for the police department when we couldn't get that information from that primary investigating officer. We couldn't get it. Now, here's where things get tricky. You have the shooting take place on the 15th of November. The detective expires on the 16th of November. Now, the question that we all should be asking the police department is, on the 15th, he was a police officer, talking about Bominka. He was a detective. He was also a witness on the 15th. However, when the 16th rolls around and the 17th rolls around in November, he now becomes a potential suspect. So we go from someone who was an officer, detective, who could give us the information that we would need in this case early on within the first 48, as now a person that has to pretty much plead the fifth because the rumors are swirling by local media outlets. They're swirling through the department. They're swirling through social media. Everybody's on this conspiracy case now. And so now I am sure that the FOP got involved real quick with this thing and said, hey, this thing might get out of hand if you are implicated in some type of conspiracy. So whatever you were going to tell us, you don't have to tell us. Okay? And that's based upon the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, where officers don't have to say anything for 10 days in the state of Maryland. And if you remember, that was one of the big issues with the Maryland Mosby case and the officers involved in that particular incident with Freddie Gray, that the investigation basically came to a halt within the first 48 because the officers are not allowed or weren't allowed to say anything. Excuse me. And so again, in this case here, it seemed to kind of like backfire. Why would you tell an officer not to really rack his brain about descriptions, not give, a location, direction of travel, particularly when you had, 100 officers on location the day the shooting happened. Excuse me. And so, it was important that I kind of, put everything, once again, I'll use the word perspective, to put it all in perspective. So the general order, policy 1008, covers that, the investigative operations and what a first responder is supposed to do. Okay, and it says preliminary investigative responsibilities. Number 2 says render aid, medical assistance when necessary. Number 7, in my estimation, is the biggie. Number 7 says ensure all suspect information is obtained and immediately broadcast via communications. Immediately broadcast across communications. If you recall, and we have heard the transcripts, and we have of the radio communications of that evening. We have heard it. I've heard it from different sources, reliable sources of the transmissions, and some of it's already been documented and printed online. And one of the things I discussed before is that we always talked about if an officer is asked by a dispatcher, a 911 dispatcher, can you give me a description? And each time you've asked that particular individual, can you give me a description, and they can't do it, then there is no description. You cannot convince me that when a dispatcher asks you for a description and you can't give it on 2 separate occasions, in my estimation, there never was a description to give. There never was a description to give. Because remember, in this case, it's alleged that both Officer Souter, Detective Sergeant Souter, and his partner saw the suspect 20 minutes earlier. Okay? That's coming from Detective Bomenka's mouth. It couldn't come from anyplace else. Okay? So you get 2 bites at the apple. You get the first bite of the apple because you saw the suspect 20 minutes earlier. The second bite of the apple happens now when you come from your cover position, apparently, and you say you saw the suspect, and he had on a black jacket and a white stripe. I will tell you, I don't buy it. I never bought it from the very beginning. And until the police department can come up with some more information, because right now, 60 days into this thing, it's kind of hard now to backtrack and give us a description. We don't even want to hear at this point there's additional information in terms of a description. That's some bullshit. And that's just the way it is. So, they failed in that regard. Simply because that's recorded. I mean, that's policy. Policy 1008. Here you go, right there. Policy 1008, investigative operations. Okay. Now, there are other things that went wrong that night or that evening under policy 705, which is called Procedures for Assistant Officer Call. Signal 13. We say it in this area, Signal 13. It means it's the same thing throughout the country, through a lot of other police agencies. That's a distress call for officer in need of help. In this case here, again, this has been verified through communications, where backup units were being called. Now, according to the policy, backup units just can't respond to a Signal 13. They have to be granted permission. And the reason they have to be granted permission is because the idea is not to have so many units in the area that everything is congested. You can't do that. You can't have every single area, every single car from every district come into a location in the city without having protection in other areas of the city. That doesn't make sense. So it's a safety issue in why it's in place. And so, you will hear, if you get a chance to listen to the transcripts, you will hear officers just saying, I'm responding, I'm responding, I'm responding. And you never hear the district commander, or the lieutenant that night, would have been a shift commander. You don't hear them telling people, no, you don't have to respond. We have enough people respond. You even have one officer who responded from Central District up to the area. He basically got on the radio and said, I'm responding from headquarters. Well, I mean, by the time you get there, it's too late. So, why are you going? And the other, again, it's a safety issue because you have cars flying through the city, 50 and 60 miles through some of these small streets to get to an officer assist call. And as we know, and while the policy is in place, you had an accident. And the accident was with who? Well, it was the detective that just got shot on his way to the hospital. And his car was involved with another car from the University of Maryland Police Department. This is why you have certain things in place, certain policies in place, so this kind of stuff doesn't happen. So I just thought I'd, certainly bring that up. Okay, let's move on. All right. Okay. Now, the best practices of homicide investigation has been outlined by the Department of Justice, as I just told you. And here it is, right here. Okay, it says homicide process mapping. Okay, this was put out by the Department of Justice back in 2013, and it certainly gives you a table, if you will, of what's supposed to happen within the first 48 hours of a homicide investigation. And it breaks it down. I mean, it does a nice job of breaking it down, particularly when it's dealing with the first hour. And I told you before, I think the first hour was the most critical hour in this particular case. Again, most street shootings, most street homicides Typically, if the person hasn't expired yet, the body's just going to lay there until the crime lab gets there. Then again, you have homicides that happen in homes, so that wouldn't be the case. But in this case here, you have a street homicide, and the first thing that happens is to render aid, which they did, would get the officer out of that location and take him to the nearest facility for treatment. Okay, they did that. So that typically is what happens in the first hour. But they also talk about within that first hour of identifying suspects and witnesses at the scene. So we do know that there are witnesses at the scene, and witnesses at the scene also indicated that they had heard 4 shots rather than the 3 shots that's always been, talked about. One thing that I'm just curious about, I would like to know, because in the best practices here, it talks about the document of vehicles in the area. And I want to know whether or not anyone took that responsibility on to write down tag numbers that were in that area. I'd venture to say you probably don't have any. Because what's to say that if we have a suspect, that suspect wasn't holed up in somebody's house that wasn't boarded up, and after the smoke cleared, just moseyed out to his car and left the scene. See, so now you can't even go back and know what cars were there and what cars were not supposed to be there because someone didn't take that information. And again, that's a best practice recommendation. And that's right. And the things I'm telling you are recommendations from the Department of Justice, but they're recommendations based upon science, based upon criminal justice, based upon what happens at crime scenes. All this stuff is developed over the years. This isn't something they just make up in the course of a day and send it out across the country to different police departments. This is based upon some of the incidences that have happened around the country in police departments over many, many years when it comes to investigating homicides, and what policies and practices are the best ways to go when you're going to do all this kind of stuff. So they've talked to legal, they've talked to your professors in criminal justice colleges, they've talked to law enforcement officials from different agencies, to come up with this. This was a strategy to put this together in terms of best practices, and it works. And this is why when you watch, I'm going back to the TV show, and this is why when you go back to watch the 48-hour TV show, it's easy to see how these officers build their cases as quick as possible. So, because of this format that's been laid out by the Department of Justice. Again, they talk about within the first 48 hours, again, locating cameras and things like that. Okay, so we know that the surveillance cameras were pulled, in the immediate area. There were some cameras that were distances away. We don't really know, whether or not they pulled video from that. But there's one thing they recommended that I didn't see. Remember, I was in the department back in the 80s, so this kind of technology wasn't available at the time. But they were talking about obtain cell tower data and dump it if needed, meaning that you could go to these different cellular companies and I'm sure you'd have to submit a court order to get this information to determine phone calls that were being made prior to the incident and after the incident. And so, I don't know whether that was done. They do, however, in Baltimore City, they do, however, have a policy that talks about getting that kind of information, but they do it in a different kind of way, which is relatively new to me. I'm not a neophyte in this kind of thing, but it's a situation where they call a cell site simulator, and guys can Google that, because that's what I did to learn about what exactly is a cell site simulator under police policy number 1004. And basically, it says here, it's a policy of the Baltimore Police Department to conduct thorough and complete criminal investigations using what? All available lawful means. The BPD possesses equipment. They have it. That's what it says. They have the equipment commonly referred to as a cell site simulator, stingray, or a hailstorm. Okay, so what this stuff does scientifically is that if they have a number already, or if they're trying to find out what calls are being made, this simulator acts as though it's actually a cell site itself. So person makes the call, and rather than the call going into AT&T right then and there, it bypasses that and goes into the cell site simulator that's right in the immediate area. Now, the only way this can work is if, in fact, you have a court order. And also it says in their policy that in the case of exigent circumstances, which means in emergency. Exigent means emergency circumstances. You can actually do this without a court order, but you better be able to justify it, because there are a lot of privacy issues involved in using this cell site simulator, and they outlined it in their particular policy what those issues are if you decide to use that. And I'm just interested and to learn whether or not the murder of a police officer goes to that level of using this type of equipment, because I've never heard it being used any other time in any other murder in the city, at least this past year. So I just wanted to, for you guys to understand that they do have something similar, according to what best practices indicated about cell tower dumping. So I just wanted to make mention of that. Okay, now I want to go back to that evening, that night. Again, Detective Bomenka is actually giving, he's talking to 911. Okay, now there came a time, and again, this is all information that's readily available to you, where he gave the wrong location. He called in for help, and this detective, who's been in the department for a long time, who's been investigating cases up in that Western District for many, many years, gave the wrong location to the dispatcher the day that incident occurred. He gave the location where the officer was shot a block east as to where they were. He gave Bennett and Fremont Avenue. That's what he gave the dispatcher, because that's what dispatcher put out as a signal 13, officers respond, officer down. So he gave the wrong location. I already talked about he couldn't give the description. Okay, and so these things, if you didn't know, again, they're readily available. And so if you want to check some of the things I always tell you, anything if I tell you, I've read it somewhere. I'm just not putting stuff together just for the sake of entertainment. So again, we want to know at this point, and I'm going to end this video with these questions right here. And these questions are for the police department. First of all, we want to know, when are you planning to release the surveillance camera from Bennett Place? It's been 3 weeks now. There's no release. And again, as I said before, trust me, the legal department and every other department is going through that video to find out what portions they want to release and what portions they want to retain. The other thing is we want Detective Souter's transmissions, his last words of his life. We want to hear whether we can make it out or not. We want to hear it. It's important that we get this information. Let me tell you why it's important that we get that information about that transmission from that officer. Because it's going to coincide with the residential surveillance video film. You see? It's going to coincide with that. It's going to coincide with what Detective Bomenka is saying or not saying. You see? So it's a check and balance that we have to have this evidence. Okay? Because this evidence is important stuff. All right? So it's going to tell us a lot. I'm telling you, these two pieces of evidence combined together are going to tell us a lot of things. So with that, I don't think I have any more to add about this for this evening. Okay. All right. So look, I want to thank you guys. You stay with me, in learning about criminal justice. I appreciate it. I appreciate your comments. I didn't get many comments in the last video, but send me your comments, and we'll see where this thing goes. I'm just interested to see when are we going to get this information. And always remember, transparency is dependent upon getting information out. Regardless of how that information is interpreted, you got to put it out there. You have to put it out there. One thing I learned when I was in graduate school, when we had to do, we were working on our projects and we were doing research, the professors told us, look, no matter where your research takes you is where it takes you. Simple as that, good, bad, or indifferent. And so that's my position on it. I thank you for listening to Advanced Criminology. Stay tuned for our next video. Don't forget to subscribe and share our videos. My name is Mike.